This week on Let's Talk About Mental Health, I'm talking about how to have healthy relationships and good mental health. So let's get talking. This is Let's Talk About Mental Health, a weekly podcast about mental health and well-being, hosted by Jeremy Godwin. Let's talk about mental health, because the more we talk about it, the easier it gets. Hello and welcome to episode 38 of Let's Talk About Mental Health, the weekly podcast about improving your mental health and well-being. I'm Jeremy Godwin. Thank you for joining me. This week I'm talking about relationships. I'll be discussing how our intimate relationships can affect our mental health and well-being, and how to build and maintain better relationships regardless of whether you're single or attached. So let's talk. Love. So much has been said, written, and sung about the subject that you would be forgiven for thinking that there was nothing left to say. But just take one look at the music charts this week and you'll see that probably 90% or more of what's on there is about love and relationships in some shape or form. So why is that? Well, it's because love is a fundamental and important part of the human experience for many people. Falling in love can be wonderful. Staying in love and building something even deeper together can be even better. And most of us know the experience of heartbreak firsthand. So unfortunately, many of us also know what happens when things don't work out. Love is a common human experience. Now, when I was writing this episode, I was thinking that I might write something pithy and insightful here about relationships. However, I came across an excellent quote from an article by the UK's Mental Health Foundation, and I'll include a link to it in the transcript, which I think sets the tone far more perfectly for this week's episode. So let me quote. Relationships are one of the most important aspects of our lives, yet we can often forget just how crucial our connections with other people are for our physical and mental health and well-being. People who are more socially connected to family, friends, or their community are happier, physically healthier, and live longer, with fewer mental health problems than people who are less well-connected. It's not just the number of friends you have, and it's not whether or not you're in a committed relationship, but it's the quality of your close relationships that matters. Living in conflict or within a toxic relationship is more damaging than being alone. And as I said before, I'll include the link to that in the transcript. So with that in mind, today I will be talking about healthy relationships that support good mental health. I'll also be discussing tips for dating, which will also help to maintain good mental health, how to deal with relationship issues, as well as advice for what to do if you're in a relationship and are experiencing mental health challenges. Now, although I'll mainly be talking about romantic relationships today, I will note that a lot of these points do apply to family relationships as well, and I did cover the subject of family back in episode 19. However, please note that I am primarily talking about our intimate relationships here in terms of your partner or spouse, as well as the earlier stages of relationships such as dating. Now, full disclosure here, I've been in a relationship for more than 24 years with the same person, so when we get to the dating bit, I'm not going to pretend that I have any idea whatsoever what it's like anymore, because the last time I went on a date, I was 19. But there are still plenty of things about dating that remain the same, whether you're meeting on Tinder or, back in the olden days on the 415 Express horse and buggy from Sydney to Melbourne. Just kidding, but it's pretty close to that. Let's get into the main content for this week, how our intimate relationships can affect our mental health and well-being. Romantic relationships are entirely personal. Some people like to be single, some people like to date but remain unattached, some people like to be in a relationship. There's no right or wrong, but for many of us, we can be drawn to relationships because the feeling of connection with another person can be both intoxicating and rewarding. Healthy relationships can have a positive effect on your mental health and well-being, just as unhealthy relationships can have a negative effect. Now, I'm going to be throwing in a few quotes from that article from the UK's Mental Health Foundation in today's episode because, this particular article was quite on the money when it came to relationships. So, quoting that same article, being in a stable relationship is linked to both physical and mental health benefits, including lower morbidity and mortality. However, while being in a relationship can have positive benefits for health, it is important to recognize that unhappy relationships are more destructive than being single. Research has found that poor quality or unhappy relationships have a higher negative influence on physical and mental health than not being in a relationship. And as I said before, the link to that article is in the transcript. That same article quotes a 2012 book called Triumphs of Experience, in which results were published from the longest-running study on human development in history, which was one that was started by Harvard University in 1938. The study found that happiness and health aren't a result of wealth, fame, or working hard, but come instead from our relationships. Now, in the context of that article, this use of the term relationships refers to all types of relationships, but it does serve to reinforce the point that when it comes to romance, healthy relationships can have a positive effect on our overall life satisfaction. And on the flip side of that, unhealthy relationships can have a detrimental effect on your mental health and well-being. Relationships that are codependent, manipulative, unsupportive, dishonest, plagued by jealousy, etc., they can all do a lot of damage, and if it's left unchecked, they can potentially escalate into abuse, either emotional or physical or even both. A healthy relationship is one where all parties demonstrate mutual respect, communicate, support one another, are fair, are honest, trust each other, treat one another as equals, enjoy one another's company, and where each person has their own identity. Here's the thing, you do not need a relationship to be whole. A healthy relationship is one that complements your life, not one that completes it. You need to be happy with who you are first and foremost before you can hope to establish and maintain a healthy relationship with another person, because you'll never be truly satisfied unless you can love yourself. Instead of trying to fill a void inside yourself with somebody else, work on your self-esteem, and that is something that's coming up in a few weeks' time, an episode around self-esteem. And that's about doing the work yourself, as well as working with a counselor or therapist. Doing so will give you a greater chance of establishing and maintaining a successful relationship now and in the future, because that type of relationship will then be based more on an even dynamic of power rather than a misbalanced dynamic if you're just trying to fill a void. And so, with all of that in mind, this week's episode is much more about the how-to. So let's dive into the how-to part. First off, how to build and maintain better relationships, and like I said before, this is regardless of whether you're single or attached. Now, I already mentioned this is the how-to section, but before we dive in, I do want to say one big how not to. I usually focus much more on the to-do side instead of what not to do. I've spoken before about positivity and positive thinking, but let me be very crystal clear, the how not to part. Never try to base a relationship purely on the physical, in other words, sex. There has to be more than just great sex to have a connection, and eventually somebody will get hurt. If you're with someone who is less than ideal, or even a complete asshole, and you think that you can change them, you cannot. You cannot change another person, so don't try to convince yourself that you can. Yes, you can influence them over time, and maybe that will work to some degree, but chances are that it will make the other person resent you, and the relationship will eventually sour. If you don't like someone for who they are, then you need to either accept the situation or walk away. Alright, so now that I've gotten that bit out of the way, now let's focus on the much more positive side, which is the how-to part. So let's start with quality, and in all things, quality is much more important than anything else. Having a real connection with the other person, being completely honest and having mutual respect, having the ability to talk about anything and everything, having fun together and making each other laugh, enjoying one another's company whilst also having your own interests, supporting one another to be the very best that you can both be, helping one another through challenging times. These are the things that matter in the long run. Everything else is secondary. Look, sex and intimacy are important in a relationship, but they are not everything. And things change over time. So, to put it really bluntly, when the shagging slows down, you better have something to talk about or you're in trouble. There's a number of aspects that are important in healthy relationships, such as communication. Actually, before I list anything else, let me just repeat that about 3 times. Communication, communication, communication. If there's one thing that you take away from today's episode, it's that what's really important in a relationship, it's communication. Communication is absolutely essential, and it's a theme that I'm going to be exploring quite a fair bit and drilling into throughout the rest of the episode. So moving on, some of the other important aspects of a healthy relationship are having clear boundaries. For example, are you a monogamous couple? Are you open? These are things that need to be discussed like adults, and there should be absolutely no surprises. Healthy relationships involve respecting one another, and that includes privacy, and I'll come back to that in a second. Things like honesty, fairness, kindness, doing no harm, giving more than you take, listening, and being present. These are all key aspects of a healthy relationship, as well as giving one another time. In other words, taking time to connect regularly and making your relationship a priority. It's also about leaning on one another's strengths and supporting one another's development areas or weaknesses. For example, I'm good at administration type stuff, while I'm really terrible with DIY. Just as a quick aside, I tried assembling a basic cabinet from IKEA a little while ago, and I almost had a meltdown after about 2 hours. However, my partner's the opposite, so we split things up based on our individual strengths. And so by doing that, we support one another as well as getting things done for our home. As I'm sure you can imagine in my case, being with my partner for 24 plus years, these things don't just come out of the blue. It's about, for example, asking for what you need. Don't expect your partner to be a mind reader because, well, they're not. And it's unfair to expect them to be one. Now, I mentioned privacy before, and I think it's important in any relationship to respect one another's privacy. There is a fine line between sharing things with other people and oversharing. And call me old-fashioned, but I think that some of the more personal and intimate things that you learn about your partner should remain between you and them. And I'm not just talking about sex here, I'm talking about in general. For example, I choose to do this work and talk about my personal stuff, including my mental health, but my partner hasn't chosen to pursue this line of work. So I make sure to keep details of our relationship private. This is probably the most I've ever mentioned my partner in any episode. And I do that because I think that it's a really straightforward and courteous way to respect your partner's boundaries and to recognize that some things should just be personal and kept just to those people in the relationship. If there are issues, it's important to address them early. Deal with things while they're still minor issues before they become major issues. If things are left unaddressed, they have a tendency to get out of control or become bigger than what they actually are. And another part of that as well is having a no surprises approach to your relationship. If you have open and honest communication, then there should never be any surprises, especially if things aren't working out. It's not like it just comes out of the blue, the signs would be there. Healthy relationships take regular effort. They don't just happen. So talking about effort, for example, what happens if you're angry or upset? Well, the most important thing is not to just react. Pause, reflect, and work out why you're feeling the way that you're feeling first. And to do that, you might find episode 12, Reflection, to be helpful. Also, I covered baggage back in episode 7, where you can dig deeper into things, but I also talked about the 5 whys technique, which if you haven't already heard me mention it about 65,000 times in previous episodes, it's a technique that can help you to dig deeper into what's going on and understand why whatever is happening, as well as then being able to guide you towards addressing the root cause. So my point here is that instead of just reacting, if you get into a situation where you're angry or upset or whatever it is, take the time to understand why that's happening and then address the root cause and do that calmly and rationally. And the vast majority of relationship issues can actually be quashed and dealt with by taking an approach where you put not just reacting, but taking the time to understand what's really going on and understand why you might be reacting the way that you're reacting. Does that make sense? I kind of feel like I'm rambling on, but anyway, no different than normal, I guess. Look, relationships like life involve constant learning and self-improvement. So it's up to you to take the time and put the effort in to do the work. And the thing with relationships is that they evolve over time, and so do we as individuals. You are not the same person that you were a year ago or a decade ago, which is something I just talked about in episode 37, Growth, which is worth checking out if you haven't already. What that means is it's essential to have open communication with your partner so that you can ensure your goals and your values remain aligned. The goals that you set or the values that you were clear on 5 years ago might not be the same anymore. If you don't take the time out to do that, failure to communicate leads to disconnection, which can then lead to animosity and, eventually, even the breakdown of the relationship. So let's explore relationship issues a little bit. And probably the first one I'd talk about here would be jealousy. And jealousy is a manifestation of insecurity. Things like suspicion, doubt, and mistrust have no place in a healthy relationship. Insecurity is something I talked about at length back in episode 35. And in that episode, I talked about it very specifically in terms of personal insecurity. And in terms of relationships, it comes back to two key things. First, the importance of open and honest communication with your partner. And second, the importance of open and honest communication with yourself. If you're feeling jealous, rather than just lashing out, you need to take the time to identify why. Again, it's about digging deep to understand the root cause so that you can address it. The question there becomes, what's being triggered for you? Why might you be feeling jealous? And once you can get into it and understand what's happening, you're then better placed to be able to talk about it with your partner calmly and rationally. But if you don't feel that you can do that in a calm or rational way, then you need to figure out why, and then it might be best to seek some support from a professional, be it a counselor or a therapist. Whatever you choose to do, make healthy decisions. Moving on from jealousy, if things aren't working in your relationship, then make the effort to try to fix it. As I've said 1,000 times this episode, communicate and get external help. And the external help bit is really important if there are difficulties, because you will find it much more effective than trying to muddle through things on your own, armed with just, a book about relationships and a handful of hope. The other bit about making the effort to try to fix things is don't just give up and walk away without making at least some effort to meet in the middle, unless it's a safety issue, which I'll discuss in a minute. My point here is that in all relationships, the adult thing to do is to try to address issues and repair what can be repaired. But at the same time, don't let people manipulate you or take advantage of you. So if you've tried all that stuff and it's just really not working and you've decided to end the relationship, what do? Be courteous. Do the right thing and explain to the other person why you've made the decision that you've made. Look, nobody really likes confrontation, but it's the fair and decent thing to do. Always be kind and treat people as you would want to be treated. Now, another one that might come up for some people around relationship issues could potentially be infidelity and what happens if infidelity occurs. Look, if you have established clear boundaries and your partner goes outside those boundaries, then you need to address it calmly and rationally. I know that can be very hard because, of course, it's an emotional situation, but the first thing is to understand what has happened and why. And this is where it's really important, again, to engage a professional. When you're really close to someone emotionally and then you feel betrayed, it can be virtually impossible to remain objective enough to work through what's happened in a rational way. So if this sort of thing happens, get help from a couples counselor or therapist. Let me be very clear here as well and say, if your partner strays, that is your partner's decision, not the third party's. I have never understood why people go flying to a rage and want to go after the other person to make them pay for whatever's happened, when it's actually the person in the relationship who is accountable for what has been done. So direct your hurt and anger at the right place, your partner. And what if you're the one who commits the infidelity? Own up to it immediately and accept that it may lead to the end of the relationship. What your partner chooses to do next is up to them, and you may not like the decisions that they make, but it is infinitely better to be honest and to have the truth out there rather than trying to keep secrets, because the truth will eventually come out no matter what. And my final point on the less than good stuff to do with relationships, what if there is abuse? Get out now. End of sentence. I know that might be easier said than done, but there are support services. There are so many different opportunities for making a new and better life. And the reality is that nothing changes if nothing changes. And your safety and mental health are far more important than anything else. I talk about this one from personal experience. I have watched my mother being beaten by my father in front of me, and that shit will leave an indelible mark on people for life. Violence in a relationship is never acceptable. So if that is the situation, get out now. I know that's really blunt, and I feel like I should soften that a little bit at the end to say not only get out now, but that you will be okay. And it's true, you will be okay. But I also feel that it is important, and that's probably partially based on my personal experience with my parents, but I do feel it is important to be that blunt. If there is abuse, then I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a case of get out now. Okay, so now that we've covered that more intense stuff, let's go back to some more positive things and let's talk about some additional tips for dating. And again, these tips are things that are relevant for all of us in relationships, whether you've been with someone for 2 months or 2 years or 24 years or whatever the case might be. So, my first is, if you are dating, be authentically yourself from the beginning. Maybe don't leave the bathroom door open, but if somebody doesn't like you for you, then it is better to know early. And if that happens, then remember, it's not about you. It's about them and their preferences, and vice versa. Communication is essential. Be a good listener and be open and honest. Follow your instincts. If something is setting off alarm bells, dig a little deeper, but trust your gut. Look, dating is vulnerable stuff. Putting yourself out there can be really difficult, so be gentle with yourself and take your time. Remember that you do not need to have a relationship to be whole. A healthy relationship does not complete you, it complements you. If there is rejection, don't let rejection get to you. It's not personal, it's about the other person. And it's actually a gift, because if someone rejects you, then, well, that isn't someone that you want to be with anyway. If you do find yourself struggling, get support, especially if you find that it's impacting on your mental health and well-being. Sometimes you might even feel like you need to take a break from dating, and so if that happens, take a break. Now, because this is a show about mental health, let me also say that if you are actively dating and you're dealing with mental health challenges, then you've probably also had to think about when's an appropriate time to disclose your condition. I think a general rule of thumb is that if it's becoming anything more serious than hooking up or just going out on a few dates, then it's best to be open. The first date or two might be a bit early, of course that's up to you, but certainly after a few dates, it's time to start disclosing. If things are getting a bit more serious and, the getting to know you stage is picking up, then it's a good time to talk openly about your experiences so that there are no surprises for either of you. And so that's actually a nice little lead in to the final part of this how-to section, which is let's discuss some tips that are specific to those of you who might be dealing with mental illness. So if you do have mental health issues, then if you are in a relationship, you might find that it can definitely affect that relationship. So let's talk about some key things to consider. The first is probably fairly obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. Tell the other person what's going on, because the foundation of any healthy relationship is honesty. Be completely open about what you're experiencing and talk to the other person as early as possible. I think in any relationship, if you are dealing with mental health issues, include your partner in what is going on in terms of your treatment, any setbacks that you're experiencing, etc., so that they have full knowledge. Again, a healthy relationship is one where there are no surprises. Speaking of surprises, if you are taking medication, one of the unfortunate little surprises that can come with that is that they can often have a big effect on your libido. And so again, it's important to have open and honest communication with your partner so that they understand what's happening and why. And if it does happen, well, look, let's just say I have been there and I know that it's awful, but to be very blunt, yes, it's awful, but don't just stop taking the meds because that can make things much worse than having to deal with a reduced or a non-existent libido. Know that things will get better eventually. I'd also recommend giving your partner opportunities to be involved in your journey. For example, if your partner is happy to attend counselling with you and you're comfortable with that, then include them. But also be aware that your partner may not fully understand what is happening to you. So be patient and be kind. If they're supportive, then they will be there for you. It might just take a little while for them to learn and understand what's going on. If your partner is struggling, but they are willing to learn or to adapt, then put them in touch with support services. They might even find it useful to speak with a counsellor or therapist on their own. And so that way they can find tools and resources that work for them and which help them to identify ways forward. Now, I was trying to focus primarily on the positive here, but we need to also talk about the elephant in the room, which is dealing with relationship difficulties while you're dealing with a mental health challenge. If you're experiencing relationship difficulties, I would recommend couples counseling. I know I recommend it all the time, but there's a good reason for it. It's about addressing things early. It's about having somebody external to provide a different and fresh perspective that's less tied up in emotions. And if a relationship does break down during mental illness, look, it happens. And if it does, then it's not personal. It's likely that the other person just does not have the tools or the ability at this point in time to provide the kind of support that's needed. You should look after yourself and seek support, both from loved ones and, surprise, surprise that I'm going to say this, from a counsellor or therapist. And it's also important to take time out for self-care. So check out episode 6 of the podcast where I talk about self-care in more detail. I mean, look, it's horrible, the whole idea of even talking about relationship breakdowns during mental illness. It's like, okay, do I really want a double whammy? But unfortunately, shit happens. It's not the end of the world, but it is something that you need support with, and it takes time. There's actually, while I was researching this episode, there were a few articles that I came across that might also be useful, and I'll put the links in the transcript. There's an article on romantic relationships from the National Alliance on Mental Illness in the USA. That was a really good article that I recommend. There's one from Psychom, which is Dating with Anxiety, How Learning to Cope Helped Me Find Love Again. And it's a first-person article, which is a personal experience of dating with anxiety and OCD. I found it absolutely fascinating, so I'll include that link in the transcript. And then the third one is actually a resource for partners. If you are attached and you have a mental illness or a mental health challenge, this article is from Very Well Mind and it's called How to Cope When Your Partner Has a Mental Illness. I think that it's quite insightful and it's a good way to actually open a conversation as well as providing your partner with some tools and just some food for thought. Because when it comes to relationships, what it all boils down to is this. You don't need a relationship to be whole, but a healthy relationship can have a positive effect on your overall well-being. Whether you're single or attached, learning to be satisfied with who you are is a fundamental aspect of being with someone else. A healthy relationship should complement your life, not complete it. Like all things in life, good relationships involve being kind, doing no harm, and giving more than you take. It's about communicating openly and honestly, and sharing a life together. The wrong person will make you beg for affection and attention. The right person will offer you those things and much more, willingly and enthusiastically. That's nearly it for this week. Each week I like to share a quote about the week's topic and encourage you to take a few moments to reflect on it and consider what it means to you. This week's quote is by an unknown author, and it is: "Love is supposed to lift you up, not hold you down. It is supposed to push you forward, not hold you back." Let me repeat that. Love is supposed to lift you up, not hold you down. It is supposed to push you forward, not hold you back. All right, so we're nearly at the end of this week's episode. Next week, I'll be talking about coronavirus. I'm not going to lie, part of me held off on the idea of doing an episode specifically about the effects of coronavirus on mental health because, let's be honest, it's been an exhausting few months, and it's virtually impossible to ignore the topic even if you wanted to. But the reality is that we are living in extraordinary times, and the pandemic is having a direct effect on all of us as it drags on. And so it is time for us to take a long, hard look at this topic. So next week, I'll be talking about the impact of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic on our mental health, and I'll be looking at things that you can do to build your resilience and even improve your overall well-being. I hope you'll join me for that episode, which will be released on Monday morning in Australia and New Zealand, Sunday evening in the UK, Ireland and Europe, and Sunday afternoon in the US and Canada. You can find past episodes and additional content at the website, which is letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. That's letstalkaboutmentalhealth.com.au. You can also find Let's Talk About Mental Health on Instagram, Facebook and Pinterest at LTA Mental Health. That's at LTA Mental Health. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave a 5-star review on your podcast platform of choice. Thank you very much for joining me today. Look after yourself and make a conscious effort to share positivity and kindness out into the world, because you get back what you put out. Take care and talk to you next time.